June 14th, 1944. Camp Hearn, Texas. The water hissed through pipes overhead, and 50 German women stood barefoot on cold concrete, stripped to their underclothes, trembling in the kind of silence that comes just before death. The room was windowless, damp. The walls sweated in defiance of the Texas heat burning outside. Pipes jutted from the ceiling like metal ribs. Drains dotted the floor in perfect rows. They knew what this was. They had been warned. In whispered conversations during auxiliary training, in rumors that spread through field hospitals like infection, in stories told in darkness because daylight made them too real to speak aloud. They knew about rooms that looked like showers, rooms where prisoners were herded in by the hundreds, rooms where water was promised but something else entirely came pouring down. One woman clutched her neighbor's arm so tightly her knuckles turned bone white. Another whispered a prayer in German, her voice breaking on every word. A third simply stared at the pipes overhead and waited for the end with the resignation of someone who had already died inside. When the pipes groaned to life, several women screamed. Others began to sob, their bodies shaking with certainty. This was it. This was how they would die. Alone, far from home, in a concrete room in Texas that would become their unmarked grave. Instead of gas, clear water sprayed down. Warm, clean, smelling faintly of minerals from deep Texas aquifers. Ordinary water doing exactly what water was supposed to do. And in that moment, standing under the spray with bars of soap pressed into their trembling hands, 28-year-old Martha Weber from Munich realized something that would crack open her understanding of the world like an egg against stone. Everything the Reich had told them about America was a lie, not a misunderstanding, not an exaggeration born from the fog of war, not a difference of interpretation or a matter of perspective. A lie, deliberate, calculated, complete. The water kept falling. Martha stood there letting it run over her face and understood that she would never be the same person she had been 5 minutes ago. That woman was gone, washed away, and what remained was something raw and uncertain and terrified in a completely different way. Because if they had lied about this, what else had been manufactured? What else had she believed simply because believing was easier than questioning? What else had she built her life upon that was nothing but smoke and mirrors and the will of men who valued power more than truth? 3 days earlier, Martha had been on a train, the same train that had carried her and 49 other German women prisoners of war from an East Coast processing center toward an unknown destination in the American Southwest. The windows had been coated thick with dust from 3 days of travel through landscapes that looked nothing like the America she had been taught to expect. Inside that train car, the air had been suffocating, not just from heat, though the summer sun had turned the metal car into an oven, but from fear, from uncertainty, from the weight of not knowing whether they were being transported toward imprisonment or execution, or something worse that they lacked the imagination to anticipate. Martha had sat pressed against one of those windows, her body wedged between the hot metal wall and the shoulder of Anna Klein, a 24-year-old radio operator from Berlin who seemed to find something darkly amusing about their entire situation. In Martha's pocket, wrapped in cloth to protect it from sweat and handling, was a photograph worn soft at the edges. A little girl with blonde braids and a gap-toothed smile, 4 years old. Her name was Greta. Martha had not seen her daughter in 6 months, not since the morning a telegram arrived at her schoolhouse in Munich, delivered by a boy too young for military service, who could not meet her eyes when he handed over the envelope with its official seal. The telegram had been brief, efficient, stripped of anything resembling human emotion. Your husband Hans Weber was killed in action at Kursk, died with honor for the Reich. Arrangements for widows' benefits will follow. 6 months ago, Martha Weber had been a teacher, primary school. She had taught children their letters and their numbers, and the proper way to hold a pencil so their handwriting would be neat and precise. She had taught them songs about the fatherland and the proper way to salute the flag. She had believed in the system because believing was what people did, because questioning got teachers fired or arrested or disappeared, because she had a daughter to protect, and protection required conformity. But a widow's pension could not feed a growing child. Not in 1943 Munich, where food vanished from store shelves like snow in sunlight, and ration cards bought less with each passing month. So when the recruitment officer came to her door 3 months after Hans died, when he offered a position with the German Women's Auxiliary supporting field hospitals in North Africa, when he promised regular pay and extra rations that would be sent directly to Greta's grandmother, Martha had signed the papers without reading them carefully. She had no choice. She told herself that every single day, when she worked 18-hour shifts in field hospitals that smelled of gangrene and morphine and young men dying badly, when she held boys barely 18 years old as they bled out on tables made from wooden doors laid across sawhorses, when she watched surgeons operate without proper anesthesia because supplies had run out weeks ago and no resupply was coming, when the Americans overran their position near Tunis and she became a prisoner instead of a widow with a paycheck, she had no choice. The words became a kind of prayer, a justification, a way to sleep at night despite everything she had seen. But sitting on that train watching America scroll past the window, Martha had begun to wonder if that had ever been true. If there had always been choices, just choices she had been too afraid to acknowledge because acknowledging them would make her responsible for the consequences. The landscape outside the train window had looked nothing like what propaganda had prepared her to expect. No bomb craters, no destroyed cities, no burned factories or skeletal buildings, or any of the visual markers of a nation being ground down by total war. Just endless fields of wheat golden in summer sun. Cattle grazing in pastures so large the herds looked like distant dots. Men in wide-brimmed hats working land that stretched to horizons so impossibly distant they seemed to curve with the earth itself. Where were the breadlines, the starvation, the desperate civilians queuing for rations that never came? Where was the dying America she had been taught to fear and hate? Anna Klein had leaned close and whispered in German, her voice pitched low enough that only Martha could hear. Notice anything strange about this collapsing nation? Martha had stiffened. Speaking such thoughts aloud was dangerous even here, even among prisoners who had nothing left to lose. But Anna had continued, undeterred by Martha's silence. No destroyed infrastructure, no starving population. No signs that America is losing anything except patience with being lied about. Before Martha could respond, a harsh voice had cut through the murmur of conversation in the train car. Elizabeth Schmidt, 32 years old, a nurse who had served in Italy before her capture, sat with military posture at the end of the bench. Her face was hard as Texas limestone. Her hands were folded in her lap with precision that suggested decades of discipline. Defeatist talk, Elizabeth had said, her voice cold and clear. The Americans are showing us their best territories to demoralize us, to make us doubt. When the Reich achieves final victory, such talk will be remembered and judged. Anna had laughed, a sound without humor or warmth. The Reich is losing, has been losing since Stalingrad. Anyone with eyes can see it. Elizabeth had stood abruptly, her movement sharp enough to make other women flinch. Several had shifted closer to her, whether from loyalty or fear was impossible to determine. We do not accept the enemy's narrative. We maintain discipline. We wait for liberation. Any other attitude is treason. Martha had found herself caught between them, like a leaf in a crosswind. She wanted to believe Elizabeth, wanted to believe that Hans had died for something real, something that would ultimately triumph, that his death had meaning beyond the satisfaction of men in Berlin who would never see a battlefield. But she also wanted to survive, for Greta, and survival required seeing things as they actually were, rather than as propaganda claimed them to be. She had touched the photograph in her pocket like a talisman and made herself a promise in the silence of her own mind. No matter what happened in the next hours or days or weeks, she would survive. Greta needed a mother. Everything else was negotiable, even belief itself. The train had slowed as it approached a small town. The sign visible from the window said Hearne, Texas. Population 4,000. The name meant nothing to any of them. It was just another American town in an America that was supposed to be dying, but looked uncomfortably alive. When the train doors slid open, heat had rushed in like something physical, dry, heavy, carrying smells of hay and mesquite, and something indefinably American that Martha had no words to describe. Young soldiers had stood on the platform, rifles slung casually over shoulders, looking relaxed in a way that suggested processing enemy prisoners was just another task between breakfast and whatever came next. One of them had stepped forward holding a canteen, his face young and sunburned and dotted with freckles that made him look barely old enough to shave. "Welcome to Texas, ladies," he had said in slow English, offering water to the first woman off the train. His tone had not been cruel, not cold, not even particularly military, just polite, almost apologetic, as if he felt sorry about the heat and the dust and the long, uncomfortable journey. The German women had stared at him like he was speaking in some ancient dead language that they recognized as words but could not parse for meaning. Trucks had carried them the final miles to Camp Hearn. Martha had pressed her face against the window of the transport vehicle and tried to reconcile what she was seeing with what years of propaganda had taught her to expect. The camp itself had emerged through heat shimmer like a mirage. Wooden barracks arranged in neat rows, painted white, looking clean and maintained. Smoke rising from chimneys suggesting cooking or heating. A recreation yard with actual grass, brown from summer drought but clearly tended. Vegetable gardens visible beyond the fence where prisoners or guards or both were growing food in neat, organized rows. And the fence. Barbed wire, yes, but remarkably low. Flimsy even, as if the Americans did not particularly fear their prisoners escaping, or perhaps did not care if they tried, because where would they go in the middle of Texas with no money and no allies and no understanding of the language? "This is wrong," Elizabeth had whispered, but for the first time her voice had carried doubt instead of certainty. "This is not how enemy prisoners are treated. This is not what we were told to expect." Anna had said nothing, had simply smiled that sardonic half-smile that suggested she had expected exactly this and found validation in being proven correct. Martha had thought about Greta and wondered what other lies she had swallowed whole, simply because the alternative was too frightening to contemplate. Processing had taken 2 hours. Names recorded in neat handwriting in official ledgers. Photographs taken for prisoner identification files. Medical histories documented through a translator who spoke German with the perfect fluency of someone who had grown up hearing it at home. The Americans had moved with bureaucratic efficiency, treating the German women not as hated enemies but as administrative problems to be solved with proper paperwork and correct procedures. One young soldier had struggled with Martha's surname. "Martha Weber," he had said slowly, checking his pronunciation against the paperwork. "Is that right? Did I say it correctly?" The question had been so unexpected that Martha could only nod, too surprised to form words. The soldier had smiled, made a notation, and moved on to the next woman in line. Such a small thing. Asking if he had pronounced a name correctly, caring enough about the dignity of an enemy prisoner to make sure he got it right. It should not have mattered. After years of being screamed at by officers who viewed subordinates as tools to be used and discarded, after months of being treated as expendable labor in field hospitals, where her value was measured purely by how many hours she could work before collapsing from exhaustion, this casual courtesy should not have registered as anything significant. But it had. It did. And that tiny crack in her certainty had widened just a fraction more. When processing finished, Captain William Harris had stepped forward to address them. He was tall, weathered by decades of Texas sun and wind, wearing standard Army uniform but with cowboy boots visible beneath pressed trousers. A man who had brought his home with him into military service and refused to let regulations entirely erase the rancher he had been before the war. Beside him stood Corporal Otto Meyer, younger, perhaps 26, with features that could have been German or American or both. When he spoke, his German carried no accent at all. Perfect, native, the kind of fluency that only came from growing up inside a language rather than learning it in classrooms. Captain Harris had spoken in English, his voice carrying the slow drawl of West Texas, where words were never rushed because there was always time, and rushing suggested anxiety that real men did not display. "Ladies," he had said, and Corporal Meyer had translated smoothly into German. "You are prisoners of war. That is the legal reality of your situation. But you will be treated according to the Geneva Convention. You will work. You will eat. You will rest. You are enemies of the United States, yes. That cannot be denied or ignored, but you are still human beings, and you will be treated with dignity because that is what civilized nations do, even in time of war. The word dignity had landed in the silent room like a stone into still water, sending ripples of confusion and something almost like hope spreading through the assembled women. In the Reich, dignity had been conditional, earned through obedience to the state, granted or withheld based on loyalty and racial purity and adherence to ideology. It was a reward for conformity, a prize for those who submitted completely, something that could be taken away the moment you questioned or doubted or failed to demonstrate sufficient enthusiasm for whatever current policy was being enforced. Here, Captain Harris had presented dignity as inherent, as something that existed simply because you were human, as a right rather than a privilege, as something that war and capture and enemy status could not erase. Martha had felt something shift in her chest. Not belief, not yet, but the first genuine crack in certainty that had been building since the train window showed her an America that refused to be dying. Elizabeth Schmidt had stood abruptly, her face flushed with something between anger and confusion. We do not accept your terms. We are soldiers of the Reich. We demand to be treated as military prisoners with full rights and protections under international law. Captain Harris had held up one hand. Corporal Meyer had not translated Elizabeth's words, which suggested he understood they were more about maintaining internal discipline among the German women than about actual communication with their captors. "Ma'am," Harris had said, his voice still polite but carrying steel beneath the Texas drawl, "you can accept or not accept whatever you like. But the rules remain the same regardless of your acceptance. You will be treated with respect. You will be held accountable for your actions, and you will be given every opportunity to conduct yourselves with honor. What you choose to do with those opportunities is entirely your decision, but the opportunities will be offered. That I promise you." Meyer had translated this time, his German precise and careful. Elizabeth had sat down slowly, her face still flushed, her hands trembling slightly with an emotion that Martha could not quite identify. Rage, perhaps, or fear, or the terrible vertigo that comes when the world stops being what you thought it was and becomes something else entirely. That first night lying on an actual mattress in a bunk that was simple but clean and solid, Martha had heard someone crying in the darkness. Quiet. Muffled. The sound of someone trying not to be heard but unable to contain grief that had become too large for silence. She had thought it was fear, terror of what tomorrow would bring, anxiety about being so far from home and so completely at the mercy of people they had been taught to view as monsters. Later, much later, she would understand it had been the beginning of grief. Not for what they had lost in becoming prisoners, but for what they were starting to realize they had never actually had, for the lies they had believed, for the certainty that was already beginning to crumble, for the comfortable narratives that made the world simple and their place in it clear. The crying had continued for a long time, and Martha had lain awake listening and wondering if she would be the next one to break. The next morning had dawned hot and bright, the sun rising over flat Texas landscape like a judgment. The women had been assembled in the courtyard between barracks, standing in rough formation, while guards counted heads and checked names against rosters. Captain Harris had appeared again, Corporal Meyer at his side, both men looking fresh despite the early hour. "Today," Harris had said through Meyer's translation, "you will undergo medical examinations. This is standard procedure for all prisoners, required by military regulations in the Geneva Convention. Before the examinations, you will shower and receive clean uniforms." Meyer had translated the sentence smoothly, and when he reached the word shower, he might as well have said execution. The reaction had been instant and visceral and impossible to control. Women who had maintained composure through capture, through ocean transport, through days in enemy territory suddenly began to hyperventilate. Some fell to their knees. Others grabbed at each other, seeking comfort or solidarity in what they believed were their final moments together. Because they had all heard the rumors, stories whispered in field hospitals and auxiliary training centers, and anywhere German women gathered out of earshot of officers. Stories about camps in the East where prisoners were told they were being taken to showers, where they were herded into concrete rooms and told to undress and wait, where the shower heads released something that was not water, where death came quickly if you were lucky and slowly if you were not. They had all heard and dismissed the stories as impossible because surely, no nation could do such things. No government could organize such systematic cruelty. No human beings could carry out such orders day after day. But now, standing in a courtyard in Texas, about to be led to showers, those dismissed stories rushed back with the force of prophecy. And every woman there understood with sick certainty that the rumors had been true, that the impossible was real, and that they were about to experience it firsthand. Martha's vision narrowed to a tunnel. Her heart slammed against her ribs so hard she could feel it in her throat. The photograph of Greta in her pocket felt like it was burning through the fabric. She would never see her daughter again. Greta would grow up without a mother, would be raised by her grandmother in a Germany that was losing a war, would probably never even know how or where her mother had died. Young Liesel, only 19 years old, collapsed completely, her legs simply giving out beneath her. She knelt in the dust sobbing, her shoulders heaving with terror that had overwhelmed every other thought or feeling. Gerda, the oldest among them at 45, began to pray aloud in German. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." Her voice rose and broke and rose again, desperate and reaching for comfort that felt very far away. And Elizabeth Schmidt stood rigid, her face drained of color, but her voice clear and hard when she spoke. "We die with honor. We die as soldiers of the Reich. Heil Hitler." Several women echoed her words. A reflex, a conditioned response, something to hold on to when everything else was dissolving into chaos and terror. Anna Klein grabbed Martha's arm, her fingers digging in hard enough to bruise. Her sardonic smile was finally completely gone. This cannot be real. They would not. Would they? Martha had no answer, had no breath to form words even if answers existed. American guards had begun leading them toward a concrete building at the edge of the compound, and with every step the panic had intensified. Women pulled back, had to be gently but firmly urged forward by guards who looked increasingly confused by the reaction they were witnessing. One guard had turned to another and said something in English, too quiet for Martha to hear, even if she had understood the language. The second guard had shaken his head, his expression troubled, his hands spread in a gesture of incomprehension. Inside the building, everything confirmed their worst fears. Damp air despite the Texas heat outside, pipes running along the ceiling in perfect parallel rows, drains dotted across concrete floor in a grid pattern that suggested this room had been designed for exactly this purpose. Nozzles jutting down at regular intervals, each one aimed at a spot where a human being might stand. This was it. This was the room where they would die, where their bodies would be disposed of efficiently, and their names would be forgotten, and Greta would grow up never knowing what had happened to her mother beyond whatever lies the authorities chose to tell. The room filled with sounds of desperation, prayers in German rising and falling, and overlapping into a kind of terrible harmony. Someone vomiting from sheer terror, a woman near the back keening like an animal, a sound so raw and primal it barely seemed human. The American sergeant in charge, young and sunburned and thoroughly bewildered, had turned to Corporal Meyer. "What the hell is going on? What are they so afraid of?" And Meyer's face had gone pale, had gone absolutely bloodless as understanding crashed into him like cold water. His parents had emigrated from Germany in the 1920s. He spoke German at home with them. He knew the stories, knew what Germans whispered about when they thought no one was listening, knew exactly what these women believed was about to happen. "Sir," Meyer had said quietly, his voice shaking just slightly, "they think we are going to gas them. They think this room is a death chamber disguised as showers. They think we brought them here to execute them." The sergeant had frozen, had simply stopped moving for several heartbeats while that information settled into his brain and changed his understanding of everything he was witnessing. Then he had looked at the women, really looked at them, and seen their terror for what it was. "Jesus Christ," the sergeant had whispered. He had stepped away from the valve that controlled the water, had moved back as if the machinery itself had become contaminated by association with what the prisoners feared it represented. Corporal Otto Meyer had removed his cap. His hands had been shaking, not much but enough to be visible to anyone watching closely. And Martha had been watching very closely because he was the only thing in that room that might stand between her and death. "Ladies," Meyer had called out in German, his voice louder than normal to cut through the sounds of panic. "Please, I need you to listen to me. This is important." 50 terrified faces had turned toward him, some crying, some praying, some simply staring with the blank expression of people who had moved beyond fear into some other state where normal human reactions no longer applied. "My parents came from Hamburg," Meyer had said. "They emigrated in 1922 when I was 3 years old. I grew up speaking German at home. I understand your language. I understand your culture. And I understand what you believe is about to happen in this room." He had paused, choosing his next words with visible care. "I know the stories, the rumors about camps in the East, about showers that are not showers, about death that comes from pipes instead of bullets." Another pause. Several women had gasped at hearing their unspoken fears spoken aloud. "I swear to you on my mother's life, on everything I hold sacred, on my honor as a soldier and as a human being, those stories are not about this place. This is just water, only water, and soap. You are not going to die here, I give you my word." But words alone could not bridge the gap between terror and trust, could not convince 50 women who had been conditioned by propaganda and rumor and fear that what they were seeing was not what they believed it to be. So Meyer had done something that none of them expected, something that would be burned into the memory of every woman present for the rest of their lives. He had walked into the shower room still wearing his full dress uniform, shoes polished to mirror shine, trousers creased sharp enough to cut, shirt pressed and perfect. He had walked to one of the nozzles, reached up, and turned the valve himself. Water had poured down over him, had soaked through his uniform in seconds, had plastered his hair flat against his skull, had run down his face and dripped from his chin. He had held up a bar of soap, white and plain and utterly ordinary, and had rubbed it between his hands until thick lather formed. "See," he had called out, water streaming from every part of him. "It is safe. It is just water and soap. I would not do this if there was any danger. I would not stand here getting soaked if this room was anything other than exactly what it appears to be. It is just a shower. That is all. Just water." The room had gone silent except for the sound of water drumming against concrete. Then Martha Weber had stepped forward, not because she fully believed, not because Meyer's demonstration had erased all doubt, but because if she was going to die, she would die trying to survive for Greta. She would die moving forward rather than frozen in terror. She would die with her daughter's name on her lips rather than prayers to a God who seemed very far away. "If we die," she had said quietly, "we die clean." She had walked into the room, had stood under one of the nozzles, had reached up with hands that shook so badly she could barely grip the valve, had turned it. Warm water had hit her face, not gas, not death, just water. Mineral smell, slight pressure, temperature comfortable against skin that had not felt truly clean in months. She had gasped. Her knees had buckled. She had caught herself against the wall to keep from falling, not from pain, from relief so overwhelming it felt like a physical blow. From the sudden release of tension that had wound every muscle in her body tight as wire. From the crushing realization that she was not going to die, that Greta would not grow up motherless, that the next breath she took would not be her last. Other women had followed, hesitant at first, testing, ready to run at the first sign that something was wrong, but nothing was wrong. There was only water, warm, clean, ordinary, doing exactly what water was supposed to do, and nothing more. Within minutes, all 50 women stood under the spray, some still crying, but now from relief instead of terror. Some laughing with the slightly hysterical edge that comes when fear releases its grip and leaves you shaking. Some simply standing with faces upturned to the water, silent, processing what had just happened and what it meant. Martha had stood with her whole body shaking, clutching the bar of soap Meyer had given her, like it was something precious, like it was proof of something important that she did not yet have words to articulate. Around her, women wept openly, their tears mixing with the water that was just water and nothing more. Because they were not dying. They were just showering, being treated like human beings, like people worthy of basic dignity and cleanliness, like individuals whose survival mattered enough that someone would sacrifice a uniform to prove they could trust what they were seeing. And if the Americans had not lied about this, if they were not the monsters Reich propaganda had promised, what else had been manufactured? What else existed only in the imagination of men who needed enemies to justify their power? What else might crumble when exposed to the simple truth of water being only water? Martha had stood under that spray until her skin wrinkled and the water began to run cold, had stood there understanding that the woman who had walked into this room would not be the woman who walked out, that something fundamental had shifted, that certainty had cracked so deeply it might never be whole again. And she had thought about Greta, about Hans dying at Kursk, believing his death had meaning, about all the boys in her field hospital whispering final words about honor and sacrifice and victory, about Elizabeth standing rigid and frightened, but still declaring loyalty to a Reich that had sent them all here to die or be captured with equal indifference. She had thought about all of that and understood that the real battle was only just beginning. Not a battle of weapons or territory, but a battle between what she had been taught to believe and what she was being forced to see, between comfortable lies and uncomfortable truths, between the person she had been and whoever she was becoming. The water kept falling. Martha kept standing beneath it, and the world kept changing whether she was ready for it or not. That first shower marked the end of certainty and the beginning of observation. In the days that followed, Martha Weber found herself watching everything with new eyes, cataloging details that contradicted years of propaganda, building a case against her own beliefs, one small piece of evidence at a time. The work assignments came 3 days after their arrival. Captain Harris assembled the prisoners in the courtyard, Corporal Meyer translating as always, and explained that under Geneva Convention regulations, enlisted prisoners could be required to work. The work would not be military in nature. It would support camp operations or contribute to the local economy. They would be paid a small wage in camp script that could be used at the canteen for cigarettes, writing paper, toiletries. Paid. The word landed strangely. Prisoners being compensated for labor, as if their time had value, as if they were workers rather than captives. Martha was assigned to the camp library, a small building near the administration offices that held perhaps 200 books in English, a few in German, newspapers that arrived weekly from San Antonio, and a desk where she would catalog new acquisitions and help other prisoners find reading material. It was quiet work. Solitary. The kind of assignment that gave too much time to think. Anna Klein was sent to kitchen duty, Elizabeth Schmidt to the laundry, though she had requested medical work and been denied for reasons that were not explained. Others were assigned to the gardens, to maintenance, to sewing uniforms that needed repair. Each assignment came with specific hours and clear expectations. Structure, routine, the mundane machinery of daily life, continuing even in captivity. What Martha observed during those first weeks of work shattered her understanding more effectively than any single dramatic revelation could have managed. The American guards were not monsters. They were boys, 18, 20, 22 years old. Farm kids from Oklahoma and factory workers from Detroit and college students who had enlisted before finishing their degrees. They played baseball in the evenings after their shifts ended, the crack of bat against ball carrying across the compound, while the sun painted the sky in shades of orange and red that looked exactly like the sunsets over Munich, except here there were no bombers, no air raid sirens, no fear that the beauty would be interrupted by death falling from above. The guards laughed, told jokes, showed photographs of girlfriends and wives and babies born while they were away. They sang along to music that played on radios in the guard stations, songs Martha did not know in a language she was only beginning to understand fragments of. They moved with the casual confidence of young men who had never known real hunger, whose bodies were strong and healthy from lives of adequate nutrition and medical care, and the simple assumption that tomorrow would come and bring more of the same. They did not look like a nation losing a war. They looked like a nation that had paused its normal prosperity long enough to deal with an unpleasant but manageable problem, and would return to abundance the moment the problem was solved. The food told the same story. 3 meals a day, every day, without fail. Breakfast brought eggs and bacon and toast with butter and coffee that was real coffee, not the roasted grain substitute Germans had been drinking for years. Lunch varied between sandwiches thick with meat and cheese, or soups that had actual vegetables and protein visible in every spoonful. Dinner always included a main course, sides, bread, and often dessert. Cake or pie or cookies. Sweets. Sugar used so casually it seemed almost obscene. And the portions. God, the portions. More food on a single tray than Martha had typically eaten in a full day back in Munich. Calories and protein and fat in quantities that made her stomach hurt at first because her body had forgotten what it felt like to be truly full, rather than just less hungry than before. But what destroyed her most completely was the waste. On her fourth day at Camp Hearn, Martha watched an American guard scrape half a plate of food into a garbage bin. Eggs he had decided he did not want. Toast he had taken but not eaten. Bacon that had gone cold while he talked to another guard about weekend plans. He tossed it all away without hesitation or second thought and walked off whistling. Martha stood frozen in the doorway of the mess hall staring at that garbage bin. That discarded food would have fed her family for 2 days, would have kept Greta from going to bed with her stomach cramping from hunger, would have prevented her father-in-law from growing so weak with malnutrition that a simple infection killed him because his body had nothing left to fight with. And this American guard had thrown it away like it meant nothing, because to him it was nothing. Scraps from a single meal, easily replaced, not worth the effort of saving or the guilt of wasting, because there would always be more. Tomorrow and the day after that, there would always be more. That night, Martha lay in her bunk trying to reconcile what she had seen with what she had been taught. The Reich had told them America was starving, that food riots were common in major cities, that rationing had reduced the population to desperation, that the average American was malnourished and weak and barely surviving. But the evidence of her own eyes told a completely different story, a story of such profound abundance that waste did not even register as wrong, where throwing away food was just routine cleanup after a meal, where the gap between what they had and what they needed was so vast that individual losses meant nothing at all. She thought about Hans, about the letter she had received 2 weeks before his death, where he had written about eating snow to fill his stomach because rations had not arrived and foraging had yielded nothing, and hunger was making it hard to think clearly. She thought about the boys in her field hospital who had died from infections that adequate nutrition might have helped them fight. She thought about Greta asking why they could not have butter anymore, why bread was brown instead of white, why meat only appeared on special occasions that came less and less frequently. And she thought about that guard scraping food into garbage and whistling. The cognitive dissonance was physically painful, like holding two incompatible truths in her mind simultaneously and feeling her brain try to tear itself apart rather than accept that one truth had to be false. In the library, Martha began reading the newspapers. Her English was poor, but improving daily. She could make out headlines and understand perhaps 1 word in 3 from the articles beneath. What she understood was enough. News about war production, factories running multiple shifts, steel output at record levels, aircraft manufacturing ahead of schedule, ship construction exceeding targets, all written in the casual tone of reporters describing routine economic activity rather than desperate mobilization of a nation fighting for survival. News about agriculture, bumper crops, surplus grain being stored because there was nowhere to sell it. Farmers complaining about low prices due to overproduction. The problem was not scarcity, but abundance. Not how to grow enough, but what to do with too much. News about civilian life. Advertisements for new cars that would be available after the war ended. Real estate listings for homes that cost more than Martha would have earned in a lifetime of teaching. Department stores selling clothing and furniture and appliances with the confidence of businesses that expected customers to have money to spend. This was not a nation on its knees. This was not a population desperate for peace at any cost. This was a nation that had shifted a portion of its massive productive capacity toward military purposes while maintaining enough civilian abundance that most people barely noticed the war except when they read about it in newspapers or heard casualty reports on the radio. Martha closed the newspaper and sat in the quiet library trying to breathe normally, trying to process information that rewrote everything she thought she understood about the world and her place in it. Anna Klein found her there after dinner one evening, sitting at the desk with a newspaper spread open, staring at words she could only partially read but understood well enough. "You are starting to see it," Anna said. "Not a question, a statement of fact." Martha did not look up. "See what? That we never had a chance, that the war was over before it started, that every death since 1941 has been pointless sacrifice for a cause that was doomed from the beginning." Martha's hands clenched into fists. "Do not say that. Do not dishonor the dead by saying their sacrifice meant nothing." Anna sat down across from her. "I am not dishonoring them. I am dishonoring the men who sent them to die knowing it was pointless. There is a difference." Martha looked up finally. Her eyes were red but dry. She had cried so much in the past weeks that tears no longer came easily. "My husband died at Kursk. He believed he was defending civilization, defending our homeland from barbarism. What do I tell our daughter about why her father is dead?" Anna was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "You tell her the truth, that her father was brave and loved her, and died because men in power valued their pride more than his life. That is the truth, and she deserves to know it." "But truth does not feed her," Martha said. "Truth does not keep her safe. What good is truth if it destroys everything we built our lives on?" Anna leaned forward. "Martha, look at where we are. Look at what we are seeing. The lies have already destroyed everything. We are just now noticing the rubble." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of trucks pulling up outside. Not the usual supply vehicles, but something else. Larger, carrying different cargo. Both women moved to the window to look. A dozen German women prisoners were climbing down from the truck beds, dusty and tired, but smiling in a way Martha had not seen since capture. They had been on a work detail. That much was clear. But where? And why did they look almost happy? The answer came the next morning when Martha was added to the work rotation. 10 women were needed at a nearby ranch. Cattle work, fence mending, general labor. Anyone willing to work outdoors in Texas heat was welcome to volunteer. Extra rations would be provided for the physical labor. The work would be supervised by local ranchers who had contracted with the military to use prisoner labor during the manpower shortage. Martha volunteered, partly because outdoor work meant a break from the quiet library where she spent too much time thinking, partly because she was curious about what had made the other women smile, mostly because she needed to see more of America, needed more evidence to weigh against the beliefs that were crumbling inside her. The ranch was 10 miles from camp. The truck drove them along dusty roads that cut through landscapes so vast and empty, it made Martha feel insignificant in a way that was almost comforting. Hills rolled toward horizons that never seemed to get closer. Grass stretched in every direction, brown and dry from summer heat, but clearly capable of supporting the cattle that dotted the pastures, in herds larger than anything Martha had seen in Germany. When they arrived, a man was waiting. Tall, lean, perhaps 50 years old. Wearing jeans faded nearly white from sun and washing, boots with worn heels, a shirt with pearl snaps instead of buttons, and a hat with a wide brim that shaded his face from the relentless sun. He looked like something from a film about the American West, an archetype made flesh. His name was Luke McCarthy. He owned the ranch with his brother. Together they ran about 2,000 head of cattle on land that had been in their family since before Texas was a state. The war had taken most of their workers, young men who had enlisted or been drafted. The ranch was short-handed. The military had offered prisoner labor. Luke had accepted because cattle did not care about politics, and fences needed mending, regardless of who won the war. "Morning, ladies," he said in slow English, his accent thick as honey. Corporal Meyer translated. "Y'all ever worked with horses before?" Most of the women shook their heads. Martha had never been closer to a horse than watching cavalry parades in Munich. Luke smiled. "Well, you are about to learn." What followed was unlike anything Martha had experienced. Luke treated them not as prisoners or enemies, but as ranch hands who happened to speak a different language. He showed them how to approach horses without spooking them, how to brush their coats and check their hooves and saddle them properly so neither horse nor rider would be uncomfortable. His movements were patient, his corrections gentle. When one woman jumped back in fear as a horse tossed its head, Luke had laughed. She is just saying hello. Horses are like people. They have personalities. This one here is named Stella. She is gentle, would not hurt anyone unless you gave her a real good reason to. He handed Stella's reins to Martha. Your turn. Martha had taken the leather straps with hands that trembled slightly. The horse was enormous up close, powerful, capable of crushing her with a single kick if it chose. But Stella just stood there patiently, dark eyes calm, and when Martha reached out to touch her neck, the horse leaned into the contact as if welcoming it. Martha found herself smiling for the first time in weeks. Stella's coat was warm under her palm, solid, real. A living creature that did not care about wars or politics or the ideologies that sent men to kill each other. Just a horse being a horse, content to stand in Texas sunshine and accept affection from a German prisoner whose entire worldview was disintegrating. The work was hard, physical. Mending fence posts meant digging in rocky soil. Moving cattle meant hours on horseback for those who could manage it, or hours on foot for those who could not. By midday, Martha's hands were blistered and her back ached, and sweat soaked through her clothing, despite the dry heat. But she felt alive in a way she had not felt since before Hans died, since before the war had turned her life into something unrecognizable. Here there was just work to be done, and the satisfaction of doing it. No ideology, no propaganda, no lies about who was winning or losing or what it all meant. Just fence wire and cattle, and the simple reality of physical labor under an enormous sky. Lunch was eaten in the shade of a barn. Luke and several ranch hands joined them, the groups mixing naturally as if the fact that they had been enemies until recently was not worth dwelling on. The food was simple. Sandwiches with thick slices of beef, beans cooked with bacon and molasses, cornbread that crumbled in your hands, coffee strong enough to strip paint. Luke sat on a hay bale near Martha, Corporal Meyer translating their conversation. You did good work this morning, Luke said. You learned fast. Thank you, Martha replied. The words felt strange in English, formal, but Luke seemed pleased. You ever work a ranch before? No, I was a teacher, elementary school in Munich. Luke nodded thoughtfully. That is good work, important, teaching children. My mother was a teacher. She taught at the one-room schoolhouse when I was young. Taught me to read and write and figure numbers. Everything I needed to run this place eventually. Martha hesitated, then asked, You are not angry? That we are German? That we were your enemies? Luke took a long drink of coffee, considering the question. I figure the war is between governments, not between regular folks just trying to live their lives. You did not start this mess any more than I did. We are all just caught up in what other men decided. Seems foolish to hate you for that. The philosophy was so foreign to everything Martha had been taught that she struggled to process it. In the Reich, everything was collective. The individual was subordinate to the state. The nation's enemies were every citizen's enemies. Loyalty to ideology was paramount. The idea that you could separate government policy from personal feeling, that you could distinguish between the sins of leaders and the humanity of regular people, was revolutionary. You are very kind, Martha said finally. Luke shrugged. It is not about kindness. It is about sense. Hate takes energy. I would rather use that energy to build something than tear something down. Ranch does not run itself. After lunch, they returned to work. Martha found herself riding a horse for the first time, Luke having decided she had enough natural aptitude to try. The horse was old and patient, chosen specifically for beginners. Martha clung to the saddle horn and tried not to fall off, while Luke walked alongside offering instruction and encouragement. By the time the truck came to collect them at day's end, Martha was exhausted in a way that felt clean. Her muscles ached. Her hands were raw. Her face was sunburned despite the hat Luke had lent her. But she felt more herself than she had in months, as if physical labor had burned away some of the confusion, and left behind something simpler. Not answers exactly, but the space where answers might eventually form. That evening, she wrote a letter to Greta's grandmother. The letters were censored, she knew, read by American officers before being sent. So she chose her words carefully. Wrote about the work at the ranch, about learning to handle horses, about the vast Texas landscape. Did not write about the cognitive dissonance tearing her apart. Did not write about how everything she had believed was proving to be false. Did not write about the guard throwing away food or the newspapers describing American abundance or the simple kindness of a Texas rancher who treated enemy prisoners like hired help. Instead, she wrote, I am learning things here that I wish I had known before. Tell Greta that I love her. Tell her that I am trying to understand the truth so that I can teach it to her when I return. Tell her that the world is bigger and more complicated than I ever imagined. She sealed the letter and gave it to Corporal Meyer for processing. He took it with a nod, asked if she was settling in all right, seemed genuinely interested in the answer. She said yes because what else could she say? That she was settling in too well? That the enemy was being too kind? That she was starting to doubt everything she had built her life on and had no idea what to build in its place? The weeks passed. Work at the ranch became routine. Martha grew comfortable on horseback, learned to rope cattle with something approaching competence, developed calluses that protected her hands from blisters, listened to Luke talk about ranch life and American history and his own time serving in the First World War, when he had fought in France and seen enough death to make him value life more carefully afterward. Other women had different assignments but similar experiences. Those who worked in the gardens observed American efficiency in agriculture. Those in the kitchen saw the abundance of supplies that arrived weekly. Those in maintenance noticed that tools were well made and plentiful, that when something broke, it was replaced rather than endlessly repaired because replacement was easier than salvage. Every observation was another piece of evidence, another data point in a case that was becoming overwhelming. America was not dying, was not desperate, was not on its knees begging for peace. America was strong and healthy and possessed of resources so vast that its citizens barely noticed they were at war. And if that was true, what did it mean about everything else? About the righteousness of the Reich's cause? About the necessity of total war? About the propaganda that had shaped every aspect of life for more than a decade? The questions circled in Martha's mind like vultures, patient, persistent, waiting for her to acknowledge what she already knew, but was terrified to admit. In mid-November, Red Cross packages arrived. Mail from home, letters that had been months in transit, delayed by war and bureaucracy, and the simple chaos of trying to maintain communication across battle lines. Martha's name was called. She took the envelope with hands that shook. The letter was from Greta's grandmother, written in September, 2 months to travel from Munich to Texas. The handwriting was shaky, suggesting either emotion or physical weakness or both. Martha opened it carefully and began to read. The German words swam on the page as her vision blurred with tears that she could not prevent and did not try to hide. The letter said that Munich had been bombed again, heavily. The neighborhood where Greta's grandmother lived had been damaged, but their building remained standing. Greta had been injured. Not seriously, the letter insisted. Burns on her left arm from debris that had been on fire. The local doctor had treated her, but supplies were scarce, and medicine was impossible to find. The burns would heal but would scar, perhaps permanently. The letter said that food was becoming desperate. Ration cards now bought almost nothing. The black market had prices that were impossible for a widow's pension. Greta was hungry all the time, growing thin. The grandmother was weak herself, barely able to climb stairs, surviving on portions that would not sustain a child, let alone an elderly woman. The letter said that Greta cried for her mother at night, asked when Martha would come home, asked why her father had gone away and never returned, asked questions that the grandmother did not know how to answer without lying. And she was tired of lying, tired of pretending everything would be fine when clearly everything was not fine and might never be fine again. The letter ended with a single question. They tell us the prisoners are being treated well by the Americans. Is this true? Please, if you can, tell me the truth. I am too old and too tired for more lies. Martha sat in the library with the letter in her hands and could not stop crying. Not quiet tears, but deep sobs that came from somewhere below her ribs and would not be controlled. Greta was hurt. Greta was hungry. Greta was calling for a mother who was 8,000 miles away, eating 3 meals a day and learning to ride horses and being treated with more dignity as a prisoner than she had been shown as a loyal citizen. The injustice of it was crushing, unbearable, a weight that made it hard to breathe. Corporal Meyer found her there. How long he had been searching she did not know. He sat down across from her and waited until the sobs subsided enough that she could speak. "My daughter," Martha managed. "She is hurt, burned in a bombing raid, and hungry, always hungry, while I am here, safe, fed. Learning to ride horses like war is some kind of vacation." Meyer was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Would it help if you could write back? Tell them you are well. Sometimes just knowing helps." Martha looked up. "Can I? Tell them the truth? That I am being treated well?" "Yes. The truth is not classified information. If anything, we want families to know that prisoners are being cared for properly. It is part of showing that America follows the rules even when fighting enemies who do not." The barb landed, but Martha did not flinch from it. She was past defending the Reich's actions, past pretending she did not know about the camps in the East, or the systematic cruelty, or any of the other things that had been whispered about and dismissed as enemy propaganda, but were proving to be horrifyingly true. Meyer helped her compose a letter in English that he would translate into German before it was sent. Martha dictated slowly, choosing words with care. "Dear Oma, I received your letter. I am devastated to hear about Greta's injury. Please tell her that her mother loves her and thinks of her every moment. Please tell her that I will come home as soon as I am able." She paused, gathering courage for what came next. "You asked if we are being treated well. Yes, I am fed 3 meals every day. The portions are generous. I have clean clothes and a warm bed. I work at a local ranch learning agricultural skills. The Americans who supervise us are firm but not cruel. They follow their rules about prisoner treatment. I am healthy. I am safe. I am being shown more dignity here than I was shown in Munich toward the end." Another pause. Then the hardest sentence she had ever written. "Everything we were told about America was a lie. They are not starving. They are not weak. They are not desperate. I do not know what this means for Germany's future, but I know that continuing to believe the propaganda will only cause more suffering." Meyer looked up from his notes. "Are you sure you want to include that last part? It could be seen as defeatist. Could cause problems for your family?" Martha met his eyes. "I am tired of lies. My daughter deserves to know the truth, even if the truth is painful. Especially if the truth is painful." Meyer nodded and finished translating. When the letter was complete, he sealed it and promised it would be sent with the next Red Cross shipment. Martha thanked him and sat alone in the library as evening fell, and darkness gathered outside the windows. She thought about Greta, about Hans, about all the boys who had died in her field hospital, believing their deaths had meaning. About the waste and the lies and the terrible price that ordinary people paid for the vanity and miscalculation of leaders who would never personally suffer the consequences of being wrong. And she thought about Luke McCarthy saying that hate takes energy he would rather use for building, about Captain Harris promising dignity to prisoners, about Corporal Meyer jumping into a shower fully dressed to prove that water was just water. The world she had known was gone, destroyed not by bombs or bullets, but by evidence that accumulated slowly and inevitably until denial became impossible. She could not go back to believing what she had believed, could not unsee what she had seen, could not unknow what she now knew. All she could do was move forward, try to survive, try to get back to Greta, try to build something better from the rubble of everything that had collapsed. The library was dark now. Martha sat in the darkness and made herself a promise. When this war ended, when she finally made it home to Munich, she would tell the truth, would teach Greta about propaganda and lies and the importance of questioning everything you were told to believe, would make sure her daughter grew up knowing that comfortable lies were more dangerous than uncomfortable truths, would make sure that Hans had not died for nothing by ensuring that the mistakes that killed him would not be repeated by the next generation. It was not much, but it was something, a purpose, a reason to keep going even when everything else had fallen apart. Outside, Texas stars filled the sky, bright and clear and impossibly numerous in a way they never were in Munich, where city lights washed out the darkness. Martha looked up at them through the library window and thought about how the same stars shone over Germany, how Greta might be looking at them at this very moment 8,000 miles away, despite the time difference in the war and the vast ocean that separated them. The stars did not care about politics, did not care who won or lost or what it all meant. They just kept shining, steady, constant, proof that some things endured regardless of human folly. Martha took that as whatever small comfort it could provide and prepared herself for whatever came next. December arrived with cold winds that cut across the Texas prairie like knives, bringing with it a transformation that no one had anticipated. The Americans announced that Christmas would be celebrated at Camp Hearn, not in some perfunctory military fashion, but as an actual holiday, with decorations, with special meals, with time set aside for reflection and whatever form of worship the prisoners chose to observe. The announcement came from Captain Harris on a morning when frost still clung to the grass, despite the sun climbing steadily into a sky so blue it hurt to look at directly. The prisoners assembled in the courtyard as they did every morning for count and work assignments. But today, Harris had something different to say. "Ladies," he began, Corporal Meyer translating as always, "Christmas is in 3 weeks. I know this is a difficult time to be away from family. I know many of you are worried about loved ones back home. But we believe that even in wartime, especially in wartime, there are moments that should be honored, days that remind us of our humanity." He paused, letting Meyer's translation catch up. "There will be no work detail on Christmas Day. A special meal will be prepared. You are welcome to decorate the common areas as you see fit. Materials will be provided. The chapel will be open for services. This is not a reward. This is not a privilege to be earned. This is simply what we do, because mercy and dignity do not take holidays." The words landed in silence. Many of the women stood staring at Harris as if he had spoken in some language even Meyer could not translate. A few began to cry quietly. Elizabeth Schmidt turned away, her shoulders rigid, refusing to show any reaction at all. Martha felt something twist in her chest. Christmas, the first Christmas without Hans. The first Christmas away from Greta. The thought of celebrating anything felt obscene, wrong, a betrayal of everyone's suffering back home while she lived in relative comfort 8,000 miles away. But another part of her, the part that had been growing stronger with each passing week, whispered that maybe that was exactly backward. Maybe honoring Christmas, holding on to humanity in the middle of inhumanity, was not betrayal but resistance. Not forgetting but remembering what mattered beneath all the ideology and propaganda and manufactured hatred. Over the following days, the camp began to transform. American soldiers brought evergreen branches cut from trees growing near a river 20 miles away. The Germans had never seen trees quite like these, different from the forests of home, but similar enough to evoke memory and longing. They wove the branches into garlands and hung them along the mess hall walls. The smell of pine filled the air, sharp and clean and impossibly nostalgic. Paper was provided for making decorations. The women sat in the common room during evening hours, cutting and folding, creating chains and stars and angels from materials that in another context would have been worthless, but here became precious. Some women threw themselves into the work with almost desperate enthusiasm. Others watched from a distance, unwilling or unable to participate, but drawn nonetheless to witness the creation of beauty in a place that should have held only misery. Martha found herself working alongside Anna Klein and young Liesel, the three of them folding paper stars with fingers that grew cramped from repetition, but continued anyway, because stopping would mean acknowledging how much this mattered and how much it hurt to let it matter. "My daughter loves Christmas," Martha said quietly as she creased paper with her thumbnail. "She would sit on my lap while we decorated the tree. Such a small tree, we could barely afford it. But to Greta, it was magic, pure magic." Liesel looked up, her young face lined with exhaustion that had nothing to do with physical labor. "I have never spent Christmas away from my mother. Never. I keep thinking she must be so worried, not knowing if I am alive or dead. Not able to send letters because we are enemies now, and enemies do not exchange mail except through official channels that take months. Anna was silent, her hands moving with mechanical precision. Finally, she said, "My parents are dead, killed in a bombing raid 2 years ago, so I have no one waiting for me, no one wondering if I will come home. I am alone, and there is a strange freedom in that. No obligations, no one to disappoint, just me and whatever future I manage to build from the wreckage." The three women sat with that for a while. The sound of paper rustling and scissors cutting filled the space where words could not go. Outside the window, Texas skies shifted from blue to orange to purple as the sun made its slow descent toward horizons that still seemed impossibly distant, no matter how long you lived here. Luke McCarthy arrived at the ranch one morning with unexpected cargo. The work detail that day included Martha and 7 other women. When they climbed down from the transport truck, Luke was waiting with several cowboys and a collection of wooden objects that took Martha a moment to identify. Toys, carved by hand from scrap wood, simple but beautifully made. Horses and cattle and birds, a doll with jointed limbs, several tops that could be spun. All of it clearly the product of many hours spent with knife and sandpaper and patient attention to detail. Luke saw Martha staring and smiled. "Figured you ladies might want to send something to your children. Christmas and all. My brother and I spent evenings making these. Nothing fancy, but kids do not usually care about fancy. They care about knowing someone thought of them," Corporal Meyer translated. Several of the German women began to cry. Not quiet tears, but deep sobs that came from a place beyond words. Luke looked uncomfortable with the reaction, but stood his ground, waiting for the emotion to pass. Martha stepped forward. Her English was better now after months of listening and practicing. She spoke slowly, searching for words that would carry the weight of what she needed to say. "This is very kind. More than kind. My daughter will love the horse you made. But why? Why do this for us? For enemy children?" Luke took off his hat and ran a hand through hair that was more gray than brown. "Ma'am," he said, "my nephew was killed at Normandy, 19 years old. Good kid, smart, wanted to be a doctor. So I understand about war, about loss, about anger." He paused, choosing words carefully. "But I also understand that your children did not start this war any more than my nephew did. They are just kids caught up in what adults decided. And kids deserve Christmas, deserve to know that somewhere in this world there are people who care about them even if those people were supposed to be enemies. Because maybe if we can care about enemy children, we can remember that there are no real enemies. Just people on different sides of a line that other people drew." Martha's English was not good enough to fully express what she felt, so she simply said, "Thank you," and hoped that Luke could hear everything else beneath those 2 small words. The toys were packed carefully and sent with the next Red Cross shipment. Letters were written to accompany them. Martha wrote to Greta explaining that the horse had been made by a kind American rancher who wanted her to have something for Christmas. She did not mention that the rancher had lost his nephew in the war. Did not mention how his hands had shaken slightly when he handed over the toys. Did not mention how several of the cowboys had quietly walked away when the German women started crying, because some emotions are too raw to witness without falling apart yourself. She simply wrote that there were good people everywhere. That kindness existed even in unlikely places. That the world was more complicated than propaganda suggested, and infinitely more beautiful because of that complexity. As Christmas approached, tensions that had been building since arrival finally came to a head. The prisoners had divided into 2 clear factions over the months. Those who accepted what they were seeing and had begun to question everything the Reich had taught them. And those who refused to accept, who clung to old certainties like drowning people cling to wreckage, who viewed any softening toward the Americans as betrayal of the worst kind. Elizabeth Schmidt led the second group. About 15 women followed her with varying degrees of commitment. They refused to participate in Christmas preparations, refused to decorate or sing, or in any way acknowledge the holiday beyond the bare minimum required by camp regulations. They held secret meetings in the barracks where they conducted Nazi salutes and whispered about maintaining discipline until liberation came. Martha had tried talking to Elizabeth once, had found her sitting alone in the laundry where she worked, folding uniforms with mechanical precision. her face set in lines that suggested she was holding herself together through sheer force of will. "You do not have to keep fighting," Martha had said quietly. "The war is ending. Everyone can see it. Refusing to accept reality does not change reality." Elizabeth had looked up, her eyes hard as stone. "Reality is what we make it. If we accept defeat, we are defeated. If we maintain loyalty, there is still hope. The Reich will triumph," the Führer promised. Martha had felt something break inside her hearing those words. Something that had been cracking for months finally gave way completely. The Führer lied. About everything. About America being weak, about Germany being strong, about the war being winnable. All lies. And good men died believing those lies. My husband died believing those lies. Elizabeth had stood abruptly, her face flushed with anger that might have been rage or might have been terror. "Your husband died with honor. Do not sully his memory by accepting enemy propaganda." "It is not propaganda when you can see it with your own eyes," Martha had said, her voice rising despite her intention to stay calm. "When you watch them throw away more food in a day than we saw in a week. When you see their factories and their farms and their healthy children. When they treat us better as prisoners than our own government treated us as citizens. That is not propaganda. That is truth. And denying it does not honor the dead. It just ensures their deaths meant nothing." The conversation had ended there. Elizabeth had walked out of the laundry room and since then had refused to speak to Martha at all. The division between the two groups became absolute. They ate at separate tables, worked in separate details when possible, occupied different ends of the barracks and avoided each other with the careful distance of people afraid that proximity would lead to violence. Captain Harris noticed, of course. He noticed everything. 2 days before Christmas, he called the prisoners together for an announcement. Martha had expected a lecture about unity or a warning about maintaining discipline. What she got was something entirely different. "Ladies," Harris said, "I understand there are disagreements among you, differences of opinion about the war and about how you should conduct yourselves here. That is natural, expected even. I would be more concerned if you all agreed on everything, because agreement born from fear of disagreement is not real agreement at all." Meyer translated smoothly. The assembled women waited for whatever came next. "But I want you to understand something," Harris continued. "Every one of you came here as a prisoner. Every one of you will eventually leave here when the war ends and repatriation is arranged. What you do in between, how you choose to spend this time, that is up to you. You can spend it angry and bitter and clinging to beliefs that make you comfortable even if they are not true. Or you can spend it learning and growing and trying to understand what happened and why, so that maybe it does not happen again." He paused, his weathered face serious. "I am not asking you to stop being German. I am not asking you to betray your country or your dead. I am asking you to think for yourselves, to use your eyes and your minds and your capacity for reason. Because the greatest tragedy of this war is not the destruction, it is the waste. The waste of good people dying for lies they were told by men who knew better. Do not compound that tragedy by continuing to believe those lies after you have seen the truth." The words hung in the cold December air. No one spoke. No one moved. Then Elizabeth Schmidt stood up, her movements sharp and precise, and walked out of the assembly without asking permission. About 10 women followed her. The rest stayed seated. Harris watched them go without comment. Then he dismissed the remaining prisoners and returned to his office. Martha sat for a long time after the others had dispersed, thinking about waste and lies and the terrible price of certainty. Christmas Eve arrived with unexpected snow. Not much, just a light dusting that turned the brown prairie grass white and made everything look clean and new and almost magical. The German women woke to find the world transformed, and even those who had been resisting the holiday felt something shift at the sight of snow on Christmas Eve in Texas, as if nature itself was conspiring to evoke memory and longing. The mess hall had been decorated extensively. Garlands of pine hung from every available surface. Paper decorations covered the walls and dangled from the ceiling. Someone had fashioned a small Christmas tree from branches and decorated it with ornaments made from buttons and bits of colored paper and whatever else could be found or created from available materials. It was not beautiful in any conventional sense, but it was Christmas, and that was enough. The meal that evening was extraordinary. Turkey roasted until the skin was golden and crispy, mashed potatoes with real butter, gravy made from drippings, green beans, cranberry sauce, cornbread, biscuits, and for dessert, apple pie with crust so flaky they dissolved on the tongue. The portions were enormous, more food than Martha had seen on a single table since before the war. Probably more food than had been served at any German Christmas in the past 3 years combined. The abundance was almost offensive. Almost. But hunger trumped offense, and the women ate with the same desperate appreciation they had shown at every meal since arrival. Captain Harris stood at the front of the hall before the meal began. He did not make a long speech, just said a few words that Meyer translated with quiet precision. Tonight we celebrate Christmas. For Christians, this is a holy day, a celebration of hope in dark times, of light in darkness, of the idea that even in our worst moments there is possibility for redemption and grace. I am not a particularly religious man, but I believe in those ideas: hope, light, redemption, grace, and I believe they apply to all of us, regardless of which side of this war we happen to be born on. He raised a cup. To those we have lost, to those we hope to see again, and to the day when we are no longer divided by lines on maps and flags on poles, but united by our common humanity. Merry Christmas. The room was silent. Then someone began to applaud. Others joined. Not everyone. Not Elizabeth's group who sat stone-faced at their separate table. But enough. More than enough. After the meal, someone suggested singing carols. The Americans began with songs Martha did not know. Jingle Bells, White Christmas, songs that were cheerful and optimistic and thoroughly American in their assumption that Christmas was a time for joy rather than solemn reflection. Then young Liesel stood up. Her voice was thin and uncertain at first, but the song she chose was one every German knew, one that transcended politics and ideology and the manufactured divisions of war. Stille Nacht, Heilige Nacht, Silent Night, Holy Night. One by one, the other German women joined in. Their voices blended and grew stronger, filled the mess hall with harmony that was imperfect but genuine. And then something remarkable happened. The American soldiers began to sing along, in English. The same melody, different words, but the same song. 2 languages, 1 melody. Enemy soldiers and enemy prisoners singing together on Christmas Eve in a mess hall in Texas, while snow fell gently outside the windows. Martha sang through tears that would not stop falling. She sang for Hans, who had died at Kursk believing lies. She sang for Greta, who was spending Christmas hungry and scared in bombed Munich. She sang for all the boys who had died in her field hospital, whispering final words about honor and victory that meant nothing now. She sang for the waste and the loss and the terrible stupidity of war. And she sang for the possibility that maybe, something better could be built from the ruins. That maybe Luke was right about using energy to build rather than destroy. That maybe Harris was right about redemption and grace being real things that actually mattered. When the song ended, no one spoke for a long moment. The silence was heavy with emotion too complex to name. Then Captain Harris stood and raised his cup again. To peace, he said simply. Someday, somehow, to peace. Every person in that room drank, even Elizabeth, even the women who had been resisting everything, because peace was something everyone could agree on, regardless of ideology or nationality or how deep the divisions ran. That night, Martha lay in her bunk, unable to sleep despite exhaustion. Around her, women whispered quietly or cried into their pillows or simply breathed in the darkness. Outside, the snow had stopped and the sky had cleared and stars filled the night with cold white light. She thought about Greta opening the wooden horse that Luke had carved, hoped it would bring her daughter some small joy despite everything else. Hoped that someday she could tell Greta about this strange Christmas in Texas, about singing Silent Night with enemy soldiers, about learning that the people you were taught to hate were just people, flawed, complex, capable of both cruelty and tremendous kindness. Hoped that Greta would grow up in a world where that understanding was normal rather than revolutionary. May came with sudden warmth and news that everyone had been expecting, but no one was quite ready to hear. Germany had surrendered, unconditionally. The war in Europe was over. Captain Harris gathered all the prisoners in the courtyard on a morning when wildflowers were beginning to dot the prairie in small explosions of color. His face was serious but not triumphant. There was no joy in victory, just weariness and relief that it was finally finished. "Ladies," he said, "I have news. Yesterday, Germany signed instruments of unconditional surrender. The fighting in Europe has ended. You will be repatriated as soon as arrangements can be made. It is over." The reaction was not what Martha had expected. No one cheered. No one wept with joy or relief. They just sat in stunned silence, processing information that rewrote the future completely. Elizabeth Schmidt stood abruptly and walked away without a word. This time only 2 women followed her. The rest stayed seated, waiting for whatever came next. Waiting to understand what this meant for them individually and collectively. Waiting for the world to make sense again, even though sense seemed very far away. That afternoon, Martha found Elizabeth sitting alone behind the barracks, staring at nothing, her face blank with shock that had moved beyond emotion into some territory where normal reactions no longer applied. Martha sat down beside her without asking permission. They sat in silence for several minutes. Then Elizabeth spoke, her voice hoarse as if she had been screaming, though she had been silent all day. "I lost my father at Normandy, my brother at Stalingrad, my uncle at Kursk. They all died believing, and it was all for nothing. They died for nothing." Martha did not contradict her, did not offer comfort or platitudes or anything except presence. Sometimes presence was all that could be offered. "My husband died at Kursk too," Martha said quietly. "He believed until the end, believed the Reich would triumph, believed his death had meaning. And you are right, it was for nothing, or worse than nothing. It was for the vanity of men who knew they were wrong, but could not admit it." Elizabeth turned to look at her finally. "How do you bear it? Knowing that, how do you keep going?" Martha was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I think about my daughter, about making sure she grows up knowing the truth, about ensuring that what happened to us does not happen to her. That is not much, but it is something. It is a reason to survive." Elizabeth looked away. "I have no children, no family left at all. What is my reason?" "To tell the story," Martha said, "to make sure people remember what lies cost, to be a witness so that maybe it does not happen again. That is reason enough." They sat together until the sun began to set, 2 women who had been on opposite sides of every argument since arrival, united finally by shared grief and the beginning of understanding that some things mattered more than ideology. In late summer, the repatriation orders came through. Ships would depart from East Coast ports in September. All German prisoners of war would be returned home. The process would take months. There were thousands of prisoners scattered across dozens of camps, but everyone would eventually go home to whatever home looked like now. The final days at Camp Hearn were strange, bittersweet in ways Martha had not anticipated. She had arrived here expecting death or cruelty, or at minimum imprisonment that would break her spirit. Instead, she had found something far more dangerous. She had found truth and kindness and the slow demolition of everything she thought she knew about the world. Luke McCarthy came to say goodbye. Brought Martha a book as a farewell gift, a worn Bible that had belonged to his grandmother. Inside the cover he had written in careful English that Meyer helped translate, "For Martha. May you find your way home safely. May you teach your daughter well. May you remember that enemies are just people who were told to hate each other. The truth is always simpler than the lies." Martha had accepted the book with hands that shook, tried to find words in English adequate to the moment, and failed completely. Simply said thank you and hoped Luke understood everything else beneath those inadequate syllables. The morning they boarded trucks for the train station, Captain Harris stood with Corporal Meyer watching the women depart. He did not make a speech, simply shook hands with each woman as they passed. When Martha reached him, he held her hand a moment longer than necessary. "You were good prisoners," he said through Meyer. "Respectful, hard-working, willing to see truth even when truth was painful. I hope you remember that Americans are not monsters. We are just people, like you. And maybe someday we can build something better than what was destroyed. Martha had nodded, not trusting her voice. Then on impulse, she had pulled a small embroidered handkerchief from her pocket. Nothing fancy, just something she had made during evening hours from scraps of fabric. She pressed it into Harris's hand. "For kindness," she said in English, "for treating us like humans." Harris had tucked the handkerchief into his uniform pocket, nodded once, then stepped back to let the next woman pass. The train journey back across America was different from the journey that had brought them to Texas 9 months earlier. They looked out the same windows at the same landscape, but they saw it with different eyes. Eyes that had learned to question, to observe, to distinguish between what they were told and what actually existed. When the ship finally departed from New York Harbor, Martha stood at the railing watching America recede into the distance. The Statue of Liberty rose green and solid against a sky that was beginning to darken with evening. She thought about all the German children who would grow up hearing stories about evil America, about the barbaric enemy who had destroyed their cities and killed their fathers. And she thought about her responsibility to tell a different story. Not a story that denied the destruction or pretended that war was anything but horror, but a story that acknowledged the complexity, that admitted the Reich had lied, that recognized mercy when it was offered even by enemies. She touched the Bible in her bag, thought about Luke carving toys for enemy children, about Meyer jumping into a shower fully dressed, about Harris promising dignity to prisoners, about Christmas Eve singing Silent Night in 2 languages, thought about how those small acts of kindness had been more powerful than any weapon, had accomplished what propaganda could not, had changed minds and hearts in ways that bombs and bullets never could. The ship turned east toward Europe, toward home, toward whatever future could be built from the ruins of the past. Martha stood at the railing until America disappeared completely below the horizon. Then she went below deck and began to write. She wrote about everything she had seen and learned, about the lies and the truth and the terrible cost of confusing the two, about cowboys who treated enemy prisoners like ranch hands, about soldiers who asked if they had pronounced your name correctly, about the casual waste of a nation so abundant it did not understand scarcity. She wrote it all down because memory was not enough. Memory could be denied or dismissed or rewritten by those who preferred comfortable lies to uncomfortable truths. But written words could be preserved, shared, used as evidence against anyone who claimed that what happened had not happened or that the lessons learned should be unlearned. She wrote for Greta, for the next generation, for everyone who would inherit the world that war had broken and would somehow have to repair. And she wrote knowing that the battle was not over, that returning to Germany meant confronting people who did not want to hear these truths, who would call her a traitor or a liar or someone broken by captivity into accepting enemy propaganda. But she also knew that truth did not require popular acceptance to remain true. That witness was a duty that survived even when unpopular, that the only way to honor the dead was to ensure that the lies that killed them died permanently. 12 years later, Martha stood in Hamburg at a reunion of women who had been prisoners at Camp Hearn. About 20 had come. Others had been invited but could not make the journey or chose not to for reasons of their own. They gathered in a small cafe and shared memories and brought relics. Anna Klein had become a journalist as promised. She brought copies of articles she had written about prisoner treatment and American abundance in the propaganda that had made Germany's defeat inevitable from the start. Some publications had printed her work. Others had refused. But she kept writing because someone had to. Elizabeth Schmidt had become a teacher. She brought a lesson plan about critical thinking and media literacy that she taught to students who were born after the war ended. Some parents complained that she was being unpatriotic. She taught the lessons anyway, because patriotism that required lies was not worth having. Young Liesel, no longer young, brought photographs, the wooden toys Luke had carved. A letter from Captain Harris that had arrived years after the war ended, asking how she was doing and if she had found peace. Small things that had been preserved because they mattered. Martha brought Luke's Bible and the final letter she had received from Greta's grandmother before the old woman died. The letter said that Greta was doing well, growing strong despite the scars on her arm, smart, curious, always asking questions about everything, going to university to study history because She wanted to understand how the world had become what it was and how to prevent it from making the same mistakes again. The women talked late into the evening, shared stories, laughed and cried and sat in comfortable silence. And near the end, someone began to hum, Silent Night. Others joined, softly, tentatively, building into harmony that was imperfect but genuine. When the song ended, Martha looked around at the faces of women who had survived war and captivity and the demolition of certainty. Women who had learned that enemies were just people on different sides of lines drawn by other people. Women who had discovered that mercy was real and powerful and transformative in ways that violence could never be. She thought about Captain Harris keeping her embroidered handkerchief in his desk drawer until his death. About Luke returning to his ranch and continuing to show kindness to everyone, regardless of where they came from or which side they had been on. About Corporal Meyer writing letters to women he had helped translate for, maintaining connection across years and miles because connection mattered. And she thought about how those small acts had rippled outward, had changed lives in ways that could not be measured but could be felt, had proven that mercy was not weakness but strength, that kindness was not naive but revolutionary, that treating enemies as human beings was not betrayal but the only path toward peace that had any chance of lasting. The reunion ended with promises to write and to gather again if possible, and to keep telling the story so it would not be forgotten. Martha walked back to her hotel through streets that had been destroyed and rebuilt. Hamburg looked nothing like it had before the war, but it was still standing, still functioning, still home to people who were trying to build something better from what had been demolished. She thought about Greta studying history, about the next generation learning from the mistakes of the previous one, about the possibility that maybe this time, the lessons would stick. It was not much, but it was hope, real hope, not the manufactured propaganda hope that required lies and denial, but the harder, more honest hope that came from seeing clearly and choosing to build anyway. Martha pulled her coat tighter against the evening chill and walked toward the future, whatever it held, whatever came next. Mercy had won, not immediately, not completely, but slowly, steadily, inevitably, because mercy was patient, and mercy did not require enemies to justify its existence. Mercy simply was, available to anyone brave enough to offer it and wise enough to accept it. And that, Martha understood finally, was the only weapon that never ran out of ammunition.